A warm welcome to every one of you. This is Henry of the Smart RN channel. In our video today, we are going to look at nephron physiology. In our previous video, we looked at the nephron and we said the nephron is the major functional unit of the kidney. In other words, it is the exact place in the kidney where processes take place to result in the formation of urine. So I request you to go and review that video. In this video, we are going to look at these processes that occur within the nephron to result in the formation of urine. Just as a reminder, the nephron is divided into two major parts. We have the renal corpuscle and the tubular section. The renal corpuscle is made up of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus is a series of semi-permeable capillaries in which filtration takes place, while the Bowman's capsule is the cup-like structure that holds or in which that glomerulus is contained. Then we have two arterioles. We have the efferent arteriole that delivers blood to the glomerulus for filtration, and then the efferent arteriole that moves blood out of the glomerulus after filtration. And it is this efferent arteriole that comes and winds itself along the path of this nephron to result in the formation of peritubular capillaries. So these capillaries that you see around the nephron are referred to as the peritubular capillaries. And then the tubular section of the nephron consists of the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. The loop of Henle has got the descending loop of Henle and the ascending loop of Henle. So these are the areas in which we are going to see various processes occurring and resulting in the formation of urine. Then another thing you have to note is that this nephron is lying in two layers of the kidney. We have the top layer, we said it's the cortex, and the inner layer referred to as the medulla. So this loop of Henle comes into the medulla either shallowly or deeply. Remember we said that nephrons are either cortical nephrons or juxtamedullary nephrons. Cortical nephrons are those with a very short loop of Henle that only enters the renal medulla on the outer surfaces. But the juxtamedullary nephrons are those with a very long loop of Henle that goes deep into the medulla. So cortical nephrons account for 85% of the nephrons, and as such, most of the filtration in the kidney occurs in the cortical nephron. So let's see how this happens. Now, the efferent arteriole delivers blood to the glomerulus, and we have said the glomerulus is a network of semi-permeable capillaries. Now, the high pressure in this glomerulus forces smaller particles to move out of the blood into the Bowman's space of the Bowman's capsule. And the particles that move out of the blood are water, ions, glucose, urea, creatinine, and even amino acid. Now, this process of particles moving out of the glomerulus via these semi-permeable capillaries is referred to as filtration. So because of the high pressure, filtration occurs to result in the movement of smaller particles out of this particular glomerulus. Now, one thing I want you to note is that in normal circumstances, we do not expect proteins or blood cells to move out of the glomerulus. Blood cells and proteins are large, and as such, they should not move. They should not move out of these capillaries. This is just in normal circumstances. But we have got other times when we have got various conditions in the kidney that will force these proteins and blood cells to move out with this other glomerular filtrate element. So in normal circumstances, just know that in normal circumstances, we do not expect to find proteins or blood cells in this particular filter. So only smaller ions or only smaller particles are able to filter out. Now I want to point out something, that this creatinine here is one of the elements that we normally look at when we are assessing kidney function. Now, if there is a higher concentration of creatinine beyond the normal values in our bloodstream, then we know that there is a problem with the kidney function. The kidney functions very well if it is able to clear creatinine or to keep the creatinine levels in the blood within the normal ranges. So one of the things that we normally look at when we are considering kidney function is the creatinine levels in our blood stream. So in filtration, the smaller particles move out of the glomerulus and collect in this Bowman's space. Now in this Bowman's space, this filtrate is referred as the glomerular filtrate. Now once filtration has taken place, the glomerular filtration will begin its journey into the tubular section of the nephron. And the first place where this glomerular filtrate lands is in the proximal convoluted tubule. At this time, it is no longer the glomerular filtrate, but now it is referred to as the tubular filtrate. Once it moves out of here into the tubular section, it is now the tubular filtrate. So the first place it comes is in the proximal convoluted tubule. In the proximal convoluted tubule, another process takes place, and that process is referred to as reabsorption. This is where most of those elements which were filtered out from the blood are reabsorbed into the blood stream. Now we say that one of those elements that is filtered with the glomerular filtrate is glucose. Now in normal circumstances, 100% of this glucose is reabsorbed into the body. Why? Because we need it for the normal functioning of our bodies. 100% of the amino acids are reabsorbed. Why? Because we need them for our normal functioning of our bodies. Most of the water, the potassium, the bicarbonate, and even the urea are reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. In fact, 65% of reabsorption occurs in the proximal convoluted tubule. But one thing I want you to note is that this reabsorption is selective. What do I mean? What I mean is that it depends on the concentration of that element in the bloodstream. For example, let's look at glucose. We have just said that in normal circumstances, 100% of the glucose is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. But what about cases where the patients have hypo and hyperglycemia? In cases of hyperglycemia or elevated blood glucose, you find that very little or no glucose is going to be reabsorbed because the kidneys are trying to clear this glucose from our bodies because it is in a high concentration. So in hyperglycemia, very little or no glucose is going to be reabsorbed. And that's why I say it is selective. It depends on the amount of that particular element in the bloodstream. But in normal circumstances, 100% of the glucose and 100% of the amino acids are reabsorbed in this proximal convoluted tubule. Another thing that happens in the proximal convoluted tubule is what is referred to as secretion. Now, secretion is where we have elements moving from the bloodstream into the tubular filtrate so that they can be removed from our bodies through urine. Now, in this section here, remember we have the peritubular capillaries. Now, drugs, and especially antibiotics and diuretics, are reabsorbed, they are secreted from our bloodstream into the tubular filtrate so that they can be removed from our bodies. Remember, there are some drugs which cannot be administered before we ascertain the function of the kidney. If the kidney is not functioning well, some of these drugs are not going to be administered. Why? because they may result in toxicity in our bodies, because it's the work of the kidney to clear these drugs from our bodies. So if the kidneys are not functioning well, then these drugs may as well not be administered. So that's why I said that in this place here, we have secretion. We have drugs like antibiotics and diuretics, which are going to be cleared from our blood, and they come into the tubular filtrate so that they can actually move along with this filtrate to be removed from our bodies through urine. So we have secretion. So remember, in the proximal convoluted tubule, we have reabsorption and secretion, which takes place to result in formation of that particular urine. Now, from the proximal convoluted tubule, our tubular filtrate comes into the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle is divided into two. We have the descending loop of Henle and the ascending loop of Henle. Now, the descending loop of Henle is permeable to water. So when this filtrate comes in this place, most of the water is reabsorbed in that particular section. Water moves out of the tubular filtrate into the bloodstream because the descending loop of Henle is permeable. Now, apart from the permeability of descending loop of Henle, this is the renal medulla. The renal medulla is very salty. So the salty nature of this renal medulla also causes water to move into this particular section. Remember, water follows salt. So because this area is very salty, most of the water is going to come out in that particular region. And as this water comes out from this descending loop of Henle, the urine becomes more and more concentrated. So remember, this section, descending loop of Henle, is permeable to water. So water gets out into this particular bloodstream. Now, from the descending loop of Henle, the tubular filtrate comes into the ascending loop of Henle. Now, the ascending loop of Henle is not permeable to water. So there is no water that is lost in that particular area. Instead, we only have ions moving out of the tubular filtrate. So we have potassium, we have sodium and chloride. Now, this sodium and chloride, as they move out of this tubular filtrate into this area, they help to keep the renal medulla salty. Remember, we said this area is very salty, and that's why, because the descending loop of Henle is permeable, water gets out. So these ions that move out of the tubular filtrate into this region here, they help to keep the renal medulla very salty. So there is no loss of water in this area. But remember, by the time the tubular filtrate reaches here, it is very concentrated because large amounts of water have been reabsorbed in that area. Now, from the descending loop of Henle, the tubular filtrate comes into the distal convoluted tubule. In the distal convoluted tubule, we have got more reabsorption that takes place in that area. Now, we have sodium and water reabsorption that takes place under the influence of a hormone referred to as aldosterone. This hormone is produced by the cortex of the adrenal gland. So this aldosterone helps to absorb most of the water in this particular region, the water and the sodium. Remember, aldosterone conserves sodium. And because I said that sodium and water follows sodium, so water is also going to be reabsorbed in that area. Aldosterone conserves sodium and it weighs or excretes potassium. So in that area, we are going to have a lot of water reabsorption, sodium reabsorption under the influence of aldosterone. We also have bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is also going to be reabsorbed in that area. When we are looking at the function of the kidney, we say the kidneys are involved in acid-base balance. They have to balance between acidity and alkalinity in our bodies so that we don't have acidity and also we don't have alkalinity. So this bicarbonate is reabsorbed to try to prevent our bodies from going into acidity. So it helps to maintain that particular balance. So that occurs in the distal convoluted tubule. We also have calcium. Calcium is also absorbed in the distal convoluted tubule, and this calcium is absorbed under the influence of the parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone helps to reabsorb calcium in that particular area. From the distal convoluted tubule, the tubular filtrate comes into the collecting duct. In the collecting duct, there is also more water reabsorption under the influence of antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is produced by the posterior pituitary gland. So this antidiuretic hormone will help to reabsorb some of this particular water in the collecting duct. We also have reabsorption of some urea and also some sodium in that particular region. So by the time this filtrate comes here, a lot of water has been reabsorbed, and this filtrate is very concentrated to come down as urine. So after all those processes, the filtrate arrives at the renal papilla. Remember, we said the renal papilla refers to the narrow ends of the pyramid. So this collecting duct is just emptying the contents here at the renal papilla. And then from the renal papilla, they go into the minor calyx, from the minor calyx to the major calyx, from the major calyx to the renal pelvis, the ureter, the bladder, and even the urethra. So that's how urine is able to move from the glomerulus all the way up to the renal papilla after all these processes of filtration, reabsorption, and secretion have taken place to result in the formation of urine. So that brings us to an end of this video on the renal nephron physiology. So as always, drop a comment, like this video, share this video, and if you have not subscribed yet to this channel, please do so. From me here, it is a goodbye.